Okay, it is 10:05. Let's start the meeting. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Wednesday, July 26th occurrence of Ambient Work Group meeting here. I will present the agenda momentarily. All right, there it is. Okay, so first, just a quick update. A group of us met last week and went through the rest of the Drive Ambient Mesh to beta document. As you recall, a couple of weeks ago, we finished up until, I believe, this point on integration testing. We've gone through the rest of the doc and prioritized all these sub tracks here. Also, most importantly, assign owners. So the call for the community is please go through and take a look at the doc and give us your feedback on whether you agree with the priority rankings here. So everything that's marked as P0 essentially means that it's a must-have for ambient beta. And then P1s and P2s, those are good to haves. And also, for each one of these areas, we have the leads called out and specified here. So the lead's job is to ensure that the items, features, or deliverables, however you want to call it, are filled out, and we turn those into issues so that we can start triaging them and tracking them in the GitHub issue board. Okay, so that's my quick announcement. And with that, I'll turn over to Stephen about hairpinning.
Yeah, so right now, if you have a plain text client, uncaptured or external client, try to talk to something that has a waypoint. The server-side cTunnel will capture it, attempt to hairpin, and if the client IP is something that cTunnel knows about, it will try to impersonate it, and it will get denied by SDOD because it doesn't have, or potentially denied by SDOD if it doesn't happen to have something with the same service account on the node. So we need to kind of decide what the behavior should be. I don't think even if it happened to have one of those service accounts on the node, it's appropriate to hairpin or to impersonate. Yeah, so we need to decide on like how we're going to set the HBone identity. Like if it was forwarding plain text to be fine, but if it's forwarding HBone, it needs an identity. I don't know what that should necessarily be besides something that signifies this is like coming from outside of the mesh. I mean, the proposal I have right now is like we just create a dedicated thing for like unauthenticated. But I'm wondering if there's any argument for impersonating when we happen to be able to, or not.
Do we ever want to know that it's zTunnel specifically that's saying it's unauthenticated? I guess not, right? Anyone can say they're unauthenticated. Like I was thinking, do we want to use zTunnel's ID but then somehow indicate that it's unauthenticated?
Zaka pointed out that would be like, we'd have to have like a special zTunnel unauthenticated, because I could imagine somehow you talk to SDOD or something else that's like, hey, zTunnel is allowed to do special things.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I think it's also unreliable because you're saying I'm actually this identity, but then you're later saying somewhere else less trusted, like a header or something like, hey, actually, I'm not this identity. So it's probably not reliable. I feel like I heard a hand, and I think I saw Costin put a hand, but there's no hand on the chat. Is that you, Costin?
Yeah, no, it's me. That's a pretty huge change in security posture and pretty much everything for Istio. I'm not entirely sure if it's, is to be taken lightly. That's, and maybe it's time to discuss again the delegation and more kind of safer ways to do this if we want that avoids this problem. Basically, kind of having workload discovery service return the IP of zTunnel and the identity of zTunnel to be expected, and then having zTunnel use SNI or whatever to do the rest without having to have the inbound interception or the complexity that is associated, both CNI and other things. Because technically the incoming part is, can be very straightforward and not do any CNI interception hacks or anything else. Can just, if Istio tells you that this is the exact zTunnel that you need to talk with, you are done. Anyway, that's what I think we should do long term anyway. So maybe we should do it down.
I'm not really sure if I understand the suggestion.
So it's two parts. One part is long term. We should rediscuss and consider again delegation model. And the second part is, if we want to go with what you propose, we need to be extremely careful because it changes dramatically the second, and it's super dangerous in many ways. But if we consider that in the future we may want to switch to a delegated model, then probably this will go away because that solution doesn't have this problem mostly.
I agree that it's super tricky and we need to be very careful. I'm not sure that, I think the delegation stuff only solves this if we want to say that you can't have policies on plain text, right? Like today in Istio, what really is the root of a lot of this is that today in Istio you can do policies on plain text, right? You can say, I want to deny post requests, and those can be plain text or MTLS or not. And you may want telemetry about, or L7 telemetry, right? Other things, not necessarily policies. If we don't do hairpinning, then presumably that means that we do plain text requests don't go through the waypoint, and then we don't apply policies in them. So we can only deny or allow, basically. It's quite a change. Like, I'm not saying it does simplify things quite a bit, so it may not be a terrible idea, but it is a very, very substantial change, I think.
You mean we would get plain text for non-Istio workloads? I mean, it's kind of, if zTunnel is on by default, that's not a problem because everything will use zTunnel. If you have non-zTunnel, basically legacy workloads or things using plain text, they are not ambient. So it's not, I mean, that's always been kind of, yes, it has been a feature of classical Istio, but a high cost and it's not really, I mean, if you're not using ambient, then you're not expected to get telemetry policies or anything else. You are expected to be either denied or allowed. I mean, that's a very different discussion if we have any responsibility for non-Istio to generate telemetry. So if you explicitly say, I don't want to use ambient in a workload, and you suddenly are using ambient and you get telemetry and policies that ambient are.
Well, it's not really, the policies and telemetry are on the server side. It's not really the client's choice. Right? But I mean, if you asked me that year ago, this exact conversation, I would have been much stronger of the opinion that we need to do the plain text and waypoint and stuff. A bit less of that opinion these days, given all the complexity and whatnot that we found in Ambient.
It has a huge cost and it's not a strict requirement. I mean, normally the policies are expected to be applied when both ends use workload identity. We don't. I mean, that's a made up feature that we added to be nice, basically, because we were intercepting anyway and with sidecars and why not? But I don't think it was ever a requirement that if you have a non-Istio workload, you should do anything about it except deny, because,
Yeah, it does end up very tricky though. Like, when do we start denying? Like, if we have users If users have to explicitly deny, then they won't do it, and then they'll have a massive security gap. And if we do it automatically, if they apply a waypoint proxy, then you can't use a waypoint and allow plain text traffic, which is also kind of a nightmare. It seems tricky from a UX perspective.
Unless we use network policies. I mean, we start programming network policies into.
Yeah, but I'm saying regardless of how we deny or allow it, like when does the user, at what point do we start denying it is my point.
When you have a policy, no? I mean, if you have an allow from with identity.
So any OSI policy.
That has an, yes, any OSI policy implies that, you are expecting only workloads that have identity to call you. And if you don't have identity, then you don't.
Okay, so so let's say you're in a normal state, you have plain text traffic, you apply a waypoint, it's bypassed entirely, that's fine. Then you apply a single OSI policy that says deny post requests or deny traffic to port 80, and all your traffic is now blocked. I mean, all your plain text traffic.
That seems more or less reasonable to me.
Yeah, by the way, I feel like I was saying that in a way to suggest it was unreasonable, but I think I actually don't know that I think it's unreasonable.
But for example, if you specify allow from X.
Oh, well, I mean, yeah, if you would say in the policy something about MTLS, and of course it has to,
yeah.
But it is somewhat weird. It's like with the TCP, HTTP stuff we dealt with in the past. It's somewhat weird if you say deny traffic on port 90, and then all of a sudden all your traffic is denied, right?
Yeah. But let's not forget our goal is for Ambient to be on by default, to be kind of an SCNI level, cluster-wide. So this case where you have some workloads using Ambient, some not, it's kind of a transition step, but it's not kind of the intended end state. We should not optimize for it, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it's harder in practice because you may have things that are not even in Kubernetes or multiple clusters, or even like the API server makes webhook calls, et cetera. So I agree that you would not expect most of your traffic to be plain text in the long term, but I also wouldn't expect that 100% of your traffic is not plain text in the long term. That makes sense. Like one implication of this is that if you serve a webhook, like eStudio does, you cannot have a waypoint with any authorization policies. Maybe that's fine, but that is there's no way around that, like with this.
You cannot have an Istio authorization policy, I agree, but you can have a network policy, you can have, the normal Kubernetes certificate and its own authentication. Istio is not everything. I mean, there are other policies that can be applied, so I don't think we should have the expansionist views that only Istio exists and no other policies should be used.
Is it difficult to back out of if we start by basically the behavior cost described?
Well, I think in this case, I mean, anytime we change behavior, technically, it's always can be tricky. In this case, the times we're denying, they didn't really explicitly tell us to deny. So if we start allowing, it doesn't seem that bad. Like it's definitely better than the alternative that we used to allow it and now we start denying it. That is guaranteed to break someone. But in this case, it's kind of like due to limitations, we denied it and now we allow it. Kind of feels okay unless users rely on this. So I'd say it's not the worst thing, but obviously it's not perfect. One thing I will say is that I don't actually think that that's the option one is the full extent of what Costin's proposing, if I understand right. I think Costin's proposing that plain text traffic never even makes it to Z-tunnel. Is that accurate, Costin?
Yep.
Yeah.
Which also incidentally is the safest way for people to adopt Ambient, because that would mean that if you use plain text, you are 100% guaranteed to not have any breakages, because that's exactly Kubernetes behavior. You're not interfering, and then you gradually opt into ambient feature by specifying that, yeah, I want to use policies or other things, or if both ends are part of ambient. But in terms of transition and adoption of and having a safe beta, that seems to me the most kind of paranoid safe approach.
Yeah, I will say that. Yeah, I think it's correct that there's both option 1 and 2. We still do simplify things quite a bit by doing 2, even if we don't go all the way out of option 1. Now it may be the compromise that makes no one happy, but it's worth considering at the very least. Is all I'm trying to say.
How critical is this to answer before beta?
Well, we need an answer before beta, that's for sure.
But I can definitely be like in between.
Like the easiest one, if we want a short-term answer that's the most flexible later, is probably option 2, right? Like it's the simplest. We just, in case we were not sure, we deny it, and then we can change how we do it later. But I don't think we can realistically transition to 1, which is kind of a pretty fundamental architectural change, at any point after we ship beta, regardless of the user-facing behavior. Like it's a huge change to what we're doing.
But we can do it the other way around. So if we start beta with we don't intercept plain text, then later on we can add a feature where we're saying, hey, we are starting to add some telemetry for some L4 telemetry for.
Yeah, I mean it's almost a complete rewrite of the redirection. It's like the whole protocol changes even. It's a very big change.
Nothing changes in the protocol. It's basically a client that has ambient.
But you're not just changing the plain text is captured, right? You're also changing that the HBone traffic is not captured and sent directly to the ztunnel IP, right?
No, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying any port except 150 whatever is ignored by IP table, is not captured at all. So ztunnel is no longer listening to all the pod IPs and
yeah,
stuff.
okay, I guess so.
It's only capturing port 150. That's why it's super safe, because we are not touching anything that is not ours. And if a client is not ambient, then it's exactly the same as it was before. Anyway, it couldn't have a credentials. Anyway, it doesn't speak HBone. It does not go into waypoint. So client without ambient, it's completely out of our problems. It's a network policy problem.
Oh, you're still capturing 15,000 India? I thought you were sending directly.
Yeah, I mean, until we do delegation. When we do
okay.
delegation,
Okay. I know. I thought it was just all coupled as well.
No, it's not completely coupled. I mean, it's an optimization. If we do delegation, it's much cleaner because we no longer have any IP tables in host or whatever. It works perfectly fine.
Yeah.
Anyway, and then we can start adding us in the future in beta 2 or whatever, saying, hey, now suddenly for plain text we are doing something that when we have an idea what we want to do, because I don't think we have a good idea what is the correct behavior when the peer is plain text.
Any other comments on this case? Okay, so we have these options. Do we have a plan to make a choice between them? A decision, I mean.
To me, it sounds like option 2 is the best short-term option. Right now, it's like you randomly make it through and potentially lie about your identity.
but it's the most risky because it will break some applications when we enable, because again, the smooth migration involves that you start with gradual, and so it's valid. Let's think about it, get more feedback. I mean, I don't think everyone had the full context, and we discussed it many times in the past. So
What's the time frame for us to make a decision here? Do we need to decide by beta?
yeah, pretty much. I mean, implementation is not very difficult, but the choice is kind of whatever we do, we are stuck forever. I mean, if we choose, yeah. John, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, yes, we need to.
Says here Steven's writing a short doc on this, plan to present soon.
I mean, yeah, I was planning on writing a doc, and I realized that pretty much what I put on the agenda is all I had.
So do you want folks just to comment in the issue, or are you actually going to write a design doc for folks to leave feedback?
What do people prefer? I mean, it seems like people who most likely have opinions are here.
Yeah, since I generally prefer safety, I mean, my option is clear. I mean, my preference is clear, I think, to take the safest option, which is also the simplest.
I'll try to summarize all this stuff in the issue, and if we have a lot of stuff to say, I'll put it in doc.
And then once we have that, are we going to put this to a vote? Are we going to run this by the TLC? Like, what's our path to make a decision?
Seems like a TLC decision. I mean, it's a major decision about, what do we do,
Yeah.
what features we support, what are the requirements, what are the implications. It's not.
Yes, I agree. This is a major decision, needs buy-in from the main stakeholder / TOC. So this is actually the least attended meeting we've probably ever had in Ambient. So most of those people are not here for whatever reason.
But one thing maybe we can agree is that we should have a choice, given that it has clear trade-offs, and we should at least provide users an option to deploy with plain text disabled, if they choose one. So it doesn't have to be an exclusive. We do it only one way. If I don't know.
Okay. Let's get it to a play. It sounds like a short design doc summarizing these options and pros and cons is the right way to go. And Stephen, I assume you will write that up. And once we have that, we can bring it in front of the TLC.
One more thing for completeness, I think I forgot to mention it. What is working on the proposal for workload discovery service? We discussed previously with Louis and other people about using the WDS for identity. So plain text is kind of a loaded word here. It is entirely possible that it's already encrypted by lower level CNI. And all we have to do is basically use WDS to apply policies. So there is a fourth option where we actually capture and apply policies based on WDS only without using sticky certificates at all. I don't know if I explained it correctly, or John, do you have a better way to describe it. Do you think it's a valid option? So basically, for plain text, we just look up in with WDS. We know the service account. We don't really care about spiffy identities at all because
Yeah, I think
either-
it doesn't actually solve Steven's case because we can't impersonate that identity when we talk to Waypoint because we don't have access to it.
no, Waypoint knows. I mean, Waypoint can queries WDS. I mean, there are two ways to get identity. One is inline, is a certificate.
Yeah.
By impersonation or whatever. The other one is by WDS. So if you know that the underlying IP is, has IPsec, WireGuard, whatever,
But what is ztunnel to Waypoint? Is it encrypted or plain text?
it is encrypted by CNI. It's encrypted by IPsec,
No,
WireGuard.
but not TLS.
It's not TLS, but you get the TLS equivalent identity by asking WDS, hey, I know this IP is secure because it's using IPsec and it cannot be impersonated. Tell me what is identity that is running us.
I see. But this case, we're trying to say that there's no identity.
No, there is an identity. We are just saying the identity is not sent in
Yeah, but
line,
you
it's
don't.
sent
Yeah.
out of line. So it's guaranteed because the IPsec is secure. It's also guaranteed because pilot knows from source of truth, which is API server.
Like I know you're big on getting rid of MTLS, but I think we need to accept that the default mode is MTLS, and
No,
there
no,
can
no,
be
I'm not saying-
alternative modes. But like we have to check the box. Like that has to be the default.
True, but if it's not MTLS clearly because you received a request without a certificate that is not MTLS, the question is what do? We drop it. We rely on other mechanisms to get the identity, the actual identity, and applies the policy correctly, knowing that is not MTLS. We mark it, hey, that was kind of IPsec, but not MTLS. But the policies apply identically. So that from a correctness point of view, that seems to be the best, except user needs to be aware that IPsec, needs to agree that IPsec is considered sufficient, and they presumably do because they don't use TLS. They didn't opt into Ambient for that workload.
I don't know. I feel like non-MTLS identity is like a niche edge case split product that should not be like you should either have not MTLS everywhere or MTLS everywhere. A mix feels wrong to me. And
What this bug is about, John? People not using MTLS, choosing not to use MTLS in some cases.
Yeah, but the identity should be either from MTLS or not from MTLS. If you're using MTLS, then if it's not MTLS, it's not trusted. I don't like you either trust the non-MTLS or you don't. If you trust it, then why bother with MTLS? It's just a waste of CPU, right? And if you do trust it, and you only trust it, then you ought to not trust anything else.
Anyway, let's put it on the list. It's up to TOC to decide, but it is still a valid option in many cases, especially if encryption moves into, if CNI is implementing TLS natively, then you still have TLS and you still need to have a way to get like the metadata server you described. We have ztunnel. Anyway.
Okay. Is there anything else we need to discuss on this topic?
Well, not on this topic, but while we're on the topic of security, should we talk about this MTLS XDS authentication stuff while we were all in the same room? Let me link the PR. Yeah, my question about this really was I didn't quite get the use case. it says it's about external certificates, but then is Istio also getting certificates from these external things? Or do you have a sidecar in front of Istio, or like how does this work? I don't think Eitan is here, but maybe Ben or
He
Steven are
is
familiar.
not. Greg, are you familiar with this change? Or Daniel?
I am not familiar with that one.
Yeah, basically it is just to, like, the fundamental need is to support authenticating with SDOD without the use of that token, just within TLS. Yeah, whether that's, the cert is provided SDOD out of band and also to cTunnel. Either way, it's just about adding another authentication mechanism, right? Because the only way, as far as I know, you can do it today is with a service account token that you manually copy around. So
Well,
that's pretty much
that's not true that it's only the service account token. It's true that it's a token, but there's many better ways to do it than copying a service account token. Well, I'll let you respond to that if you want, but I have more questions about the MTLS part.
I just pinged Eitan. He can join. He knows more about it than I do, but that's my initial understanding, is that that's the difficulty we're trying to solve.
Yeah, like for the token stuff, we do have OIDC off and Istio. It's not just service account off. I mean, I agree. You shouldn't be copying around service account tokens. That was kind of a universal thing that works everywhere, but it's not a good idea for the VM talks.
Yeah, I think just adding mutual cert auth is kind of what we're looking for, that initial connection.
Well, yeah, my main question is how you're mutually authenticating, right? Because outside of the typical Istio demo, it's a CA and an XGS server and everything in one, the Istio certificate and the workload certificate are completely orthogonal, right? They're not necessarily the same or from the same CA or anything. I get that you can make them from the same CA, so that's what I was trying to clarify. Like, do you have these external certificate providers providing something for Istio as well? Does it use a sidecar? Is it behind a gateway? Like, what is the intended flow?
Yeah, so I can answer this. Hold on, because I put up this PR, Costin. So I think, can y'all hear me? Yeah. So basically, my purpose in opening this PR was just again, so to start the conversation about MTLS over the XDS connection, because right now it's not supported. In terms of how we are getting those, right? I think what I was trying to do is create an interface for a mechanism that can do that asynchronously. So whether that be SDS, SDS to Spire, or some other RPC mechanism that you have, or you're loading, you have a cert that's being mounted by a separate process in the background, and you need to wait for it, right? I think yes, there's definitely this question of what is the source for those certs, and I knew that making this PR, which is why I thought about creating a separate interface other than the one that is currently being used to fetch the workload certs. So I did think about that, but I put up this PR just to start that conversation, because I think what for our purposes, right, we're using a cert provider that can use that same interface, because we just need to give it a trust domain, right? But in the general case, it's more about, how can we enable those use cases from the zTunnel in environments where the token is not available. So that was my whole context.
Yeah, go ahead, Kapson.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I'm super interested in, because in our use case, I mean, I'm looking for using zTunnel in other environments than Kubernetes, and a cert is going to be available and as part of the platform. So I think VMs in Istio Classic, it supported certificate authentication. That's a feature we had for a very long time, and is not necessarily applicable for the case, or maybe it is for the case where zTunnel is run per node in Kubernetes. But for all other environments, or when it's running as a sidecar, it's definitely the mode that will be most used or most useful in all cases. So that's pretty much a requirement for at least for my use cases that I'm working on. So
maybe John, I guess I'm wondering like what would you like to see out of something like this, right? Like what, assuming that the two, I would say, requirements, at least in my mind, are MTLS auth and asynchronous, basically for the implementation. Those are like the two.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not necessarily against it. I was mostly making sure that I understood, because I think the Istio VM doc currently is misleading and makes it seem like it's always a good idea when it really only makes sense if you have two separate routes that are understood or you happen to have the same one.
Right.
So I'm not necessarily against doing it. I just want to make sure I understood the use case and whatnot.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly what I said. Like I named the PR initial discussion because I wanted to kick this off and see what others were interested in.
Yeah, I do think using MTLS can be kind of, well, it's funny to say this when our whole product is built on MTLS, but it can be kind of tedious if you have, like, if you want to stick a gateway in front of Istio or something. Since it's not end-to-end, then you have to do the whole pass-through TLS stuff, which limits some options. But I mean, I can see, yeah, I mean, it really depends. So you guys have, I guess, some CA that already handles all of these VMs.
Yeah, and in our environments also, these things share networks, so it's usually not. Even if it's going through gateways, it's doing pass-through.
If we are talking about custom environments, we should also consider using metadata server, which is used by most platforms, and so we should be able to plug in getting access token or JOT token from the metadata server.
Well, so that's what Spire does, right? That's what just as like
Spire
a
gets
hard,
certificates.
as like a what?
Spire is for certificates. This is
I know.
for getting JOTs.
Well, so the reason I bring up certificates, so the reason I bring up Spire is that Spire allows you to do that, but then use classic MTLS. So I think if we go down the route of accepting JOT authentication and doing like JOT, like I know, so for instance, I know that Google uses the metadata server and then authenticates that JOT in Istio-D. At least that's from what I've read of all the code and seen. But I think that like doing that for every use case is a route that we could go down. But I think in the short term, focusing on something like MTLS and then using, a project like Spire potentially, which allows you to do that JOT authentication separately from the data plane itself, and not overcomplicating Istio-D.
Can you include any links about Spire and JOTs? My understanding was Spire is mostly about certificate and they didn't go into JOT space.
They do both, but you can use the Spire. Essentially you attest your workload with the metadata server JOT. So you get a certificate, but you're using the metadata server to attest that your VM is valid, basically, and deserves that identity.
Yeah, but to be clear, not only Google is using metadata server, Amazon, Azure, pretty much all vendors have a metadata server. So I don't think it's fair to say that it's a Google specific thing. It's
No. No, it's definitely a standard way, but then you need to put that code into Istio-D to validate those JOTs. So the point that I'm trying to Spire provides an agnostic way to validate those JOTs outside of Istio-D. Like if you imagine that there's already a system that does that, and maybe that's not the answer that we want, but there is a system exists such that it can validate the JOT for you and provide a well-known certificate. So it could be a way to keep the scope of Istio itself smaller.
John, a quick
IDC though, that's generic.
What?
Isn't it just OIDC, which is kind of generic?
Yeah. So there's an option in Istio that was added probably a few releases back where it can validate any OIDC token. So if it works with Google issued token, with any provider token.
So AWS doesn't do JOTs.
Except AWS. Anyone using standard OIDC, and I don't think it's a problem to support an AWS interface as well in Istio if necessary. I mean, it's broadly used, so it's reasonable.
They really don't have any way to get a token on AWS.
Nope. Nope.
There's no
No, they have the
exchange or something.
Validation is slightly different, I think.
Don't they have
Yeah,
like
you can
STS?
get one, but
Amazon.
that means that you've already gotten like it's a whole thing. It's a whole the actual VM itself only ships within like a proprietary instance.
I thought they invented the whole STS thing to exchange for a different type of token, but maybe not an OIDC token.
Is the Spire sync compatible with OIDC, or is there a new standard? Or is their own sync?
Yes. Yeah. No. It's compatible with OIDC.
And you can use it with AWS to get a Spire token, and then IstioD will see an OIDC token.
No, IstioD doesn't even get involved. You just issue an MTLS cert.
Oh, IstioD will get MTLS cert. I see what you're saying. I don't see any problem with that. I mean, as long as IstioD authenticates either a OIDC token or a cert, that's consistent with what we did for last from 0 to today. No, IstioD always supported both MTLS and JOT. So what is controversial here? I mean, I'm not sure I understand what's.
I'm not sure anything is controversial. Listening to John, I think he was just wanting more information about the use case.
Yeah, mostly. I mean, it without more details, it seems like using OIDC JOT token, if possible, would be ideal, but maybe that's not feasible. So.
Now, do you feel you have enough information, John, based on the scenarios?
So I'll just say that it's not possible for us because you're also talking about cloud environments, and there's also a lot of on-prem shenanigans that goes on. So yeah, I think that the JOT and OIDC flow can covers, let's say, unfortunately 70, let's say 70 plus maybe % of use cases, but there's still that 30 plus of issuing certificate of non identifiable workloads.
One more question.
Maybe.
Do you?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Do you really want to use Spire with SDS, UDS, whatever interface, or just Spire with CSI or whatever, mounting a certificate and not add a dependency to? Because there are two ways to get a certificate, I believe, from Spire.
So
taking
there's a bunch of different ways. What?
Are we taking dependency from zTunnel to Spire? That's what I'm asking.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of different ways, like you mentioned, and I think all of them require, like, I think that all of those should be separate from this particular conversation, right? Because what we're talking about here is just how we want to enable MTLS in the XDS, like in these connections that are happening from, how we want to enable XDS in the non-workload connections, right? And I don't think that it needs to be like, oh, how do you, does it need to be SDS, or does it need to be the workload API directly, or some mounted file, right? I think if we come up with a way that we can add each of those later, each of them, right? Because it's potentially, depending on the environment, you might want to handle it differently. Like, are you running in a VM? Are you running in Kubernetes? Are you running in a, I don't know, Lambda? Who knows?
But in practical terms, zTunnel code, you'll have a code that is getting it from where? I mean, you're going to add a Spire library, or are you going to add a read from file, or what is your plan for zTunnel implementation?
In the probably like something like SDS in the short term. So there's a shared, because like, let's say something like Spire already supports it, and it's a known interface to do that.
So speaking as Google this time, and probably other vendors that have, I would require that if we do that, we support both mounted files and the SDS interface, just like we do in Agent for sidecars. Okay, then we are.
Yeah. No, 100%. I mean, I think mounted files, no matter what, is used, even if you're just testing, right? Like, no matter what, you want to support mounting a bundle.
Okay, so it's exactly the same thing Istio agent is doing for sidecars. See.
That's exactly what we're looking for. Basically, to
Excellent.
replicate the behavior of basically wanting to run the Z tunnel without having to require the agent. The same experience.
One thing that wasn't 100% clear to me, this is the initial thingy. Maybe you just answered this and I was a little distracted, sorry. So how much connectors, like we have this generic fetcher thingy, how many different ones are we going to implement in the core?
That's a good question. I mean, it doesn't have to be this particular fetch interface either, right? We could
I don't care about the
that,
interface. I care about how many implementations of whatever interface we have in open source core ztunnel.
I mean, in my mind, I would say at most probably, definitely file, maybe SDS. I would definitely keep it small.
Okay. The reason I ask is we have this issue that's like identify interfaces for extensibility or something, and it's trying to define the minimum set of integration points for various things to support all use cases. Because Istio currently has too many. Like we have like 10 ways to integrate with secrets, and fine, that's great. But we could integrate with just as many products with probably 2 or 3 or 4. So for some of the telemetry stuff, it's like easier. It's like, okay, we do open telemetry or Prometheus maybe for certificates. There's a lot more choices. I just want to make sure we're conscious about making the smallest set to meet the maximum use cases. So we don't end up with a kitchen sink of like, hey, here's 40 ways to get a certificate, go for it.
Yeah, and I think the other way you could say that is like, I totally agree.
How about 4? I mean, the 2 for certificates plus a mounted JOT plus an MDS address. So 2 for tokens, 2 for certificates.
I think the tokens are separate. It's like you have 2 different mechanisms. Yeah, you have authentication plugins versus MTLS plugins. Because you could technically do authentication over, right, an MTLS stream if you really wanted to. No, I don't know if Istio supports it today, but I do think those are technically separate.
John, are you okay with the 4? I mean, 2 plugins for token based, 2 plugins for certificate based. Is it too much?
I mean, the number sounds right. We have to look at the cases it covers and whatnot. Let me link on the issue. I forget some of the context because I thought about this a small amount a while ago. I'm not necessarily opposed. I just want to make sure we're.
No, and I think that's why I mentioned SDS. I mean, if there is a different mechanism that others think is like kind of a go-to in terms of cert, interfaces, but I don't think I know of any.
Yeah, I think at least at the time, I wanted the Kubernetes CSR API because it's Kubernetes, so it's kind of standard API, but it's not quite the same as SDS.
Oh, it involves watching and all the other stuff. The standard is ACME. I mean, if you really want to do something that is broadly used as standard, it's ACME interface with signed JOTs and whatever. But we discussed it long time ago in Istio. It's not really feasible because of many reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't have an issue with the PR as this. It's not actually adding any of the integration points, so there's none of the contentious stuff. So I think I'm fine with that. I mean, I didn't look at the code or anything, but the idea seems fine. And I'll find adding more integration points. We just need to do a little bit of discussion and get some consensus. So. Cool.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you mentioned the CSR. I kind of want to leave like Kubernetes writing and reading. It does kind of make sense, but it's an interesting thing for the ztunnel to do, to be involved in like Kubernetes operations that deeply. Right now, it's very much just it's all gRPC. That would be a pretty big change.
Fortunately, SDS is not the cleanest API to get a certificate, but that's what we did. So
yeah. I mean the yeah. The
can I ask you one more question about SDS and this integration? Do you plan to use it? This Inspire is, kind of provisioning certificates to also get certificates for the workloads that we impersonate instead of going to Citadel and because that would be a problem.
right now in Kubernetes, no. On the VM, yes.
Okay. So it's not only SDS for getting the certificate for the zTunnel itself, but also as a way to use instead of Citadel to use some providers that, okay, then I think it makes sense actually, but probably John should be aware of it. Other people should be aware that this may go in this direction.
Yeah, that's what I had assumed. We'd have the same set of integration points and probably 2 configs, which default to being the same thing. And you say XGS client is X and workload is Y. I don't know, something along those lines.
Exactly. Yeah. Then those two also keep the code additions pretty relatively minimal and the dependencies minimal because we already have all those gRPC libraries. Cool. That's all I got.
All right, we are almost at the top of the hour. Are there any other topics? Okay, George.
Hi. I was at the meeting, I think, at the beginning of last week to talk about conformance, and I was wondering if I should file an issue or had you all had a chance to discuss it, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I brought this up at the steering committee, but the steering committee had only 2 people at the meeting that day. So we did not get much progress in that meeting. And then nothing else has happened since then. So I would say that's kind of the current status. But I also brought up in Slack, so people have been thinking about it. We just haven't had a chance to meet, so I don't know what people's thoughts are.
Okay, awesome. I guess I'll just give it another week then. And just to let you know what I'm working on is I've been investigating how the Kubernetes conformance got started. So initially, they did conformance tests on every major release of Kubernetes, and everyone quickly hated that. So they moved to a more time-based approach for a year. And that's what Chris Anacek said, that you might want to consider just starting off that way. And then my second question is there a test suite? What Kubernetes did is they kind of picked a package called Sonobui and said, if your Kubernetes thing passes these tests, it's considered a conformant Kubernetes. Is there an equivalent style of tool or something like that for Istio that maybe I could start to play with?
Sort of. I believe the Sonobui thing is just one binary that you just say go, and Istio has a suite of tests that you run with go test XYZ and a variety of flags, and you carefully set up your environment to make it work and do all sorts of things. That's maybe not as streamlined, but it does exist, and then it does run a set of tests. Now, passing those tests, I don't think it's running the right test that I would say is a conformance test. It's running things that are not specific enough and too specific and things of that nature. So, but it's kind of, there's some inkling of something there. Like there's a way to test Istio. So.
Okay.
Sorry, I missed the context on this. Is this conformance for the data plane or the control plane? Or both?
Istio.
I assume it's both.
Yeah, this would be. Yeah, this will be for everything. Actually, you all would decide
Is-
actually what conformance covers. But
Okay.
I'm assuming it
Because
would
I
be.
I
the
could
whole thing.
imagine.
Go ahead. I didn't mean to step on you. Sorry.
Oh no, I was gonna say. I mean, I can imagine, right? If you're developing an Istio solution, an ambient solution, and you want to come in and say, I want to replace the control plane, or I want to replace the data plane,
Mhm.
right? What that, or both, or what what that looks like.
Yeah, I think it's both. Like like you could replace anything, and if you do, it should still pass the test. Is kind of what performance tries to solve.
Mhm.
Same with Kubernetes, right? You could replace kubelet or the API server or anything in between, really, and as long as you pass the test, then you're Kubernetes.
Yeah, because that's K3S passes it and it swaps out lots of stuff. Okay, thanks. I was just checking in. Are
Yeah,
any
sorry
of
we
you going
didn't
to
get
be at
back to you,
KubeCon? Oh, it's okay. These
I'll be
are
there.
things like this are very, got to get the process moving a little bit every week. So, okay, awesome. Thank you.
Cool. I think we
All right.
are out of time, so
Yeah.
see you all next week.
Thanks, everybody.